I drove to a nearby gas station. I had to map quest it because this was in the middle of nowhere and I didn't know where anything was. I charged inside the store and nodded at the guy behind the counter. Gas cans? In the counter, he answered, barely glancing up from his phone. I grabbed 4 gas cans off the shelf and walked up to the register. I held one up. I got 4, I said. The clerk tapped on the screen a few times and then looked at me. 21.46. He watched me take the money from my wallet and I couldn't tell if he was staring at me suspiciously or if it was just a smudge on the dirty plexiglass distorting his face. I avoided eye contact. Keep the change, I said, and stepped out, using my back to open the door as the clerk had droned to have a good night. Not likely. I filled the gas cans at the pump, impatiently tapping my fingers on the roof of the car. I screwed the cap onto the last can and tossed it in the trunk, slamming the door and getting into the driver's seat. I pulled out of the parking lot and turned in the direction of Site 49, pressing hard on the accelerator. If the cops pulled me over, I'd bring them with me. I wasn't nervous this time. I wasn't sick to my stomach or ruminating over every possible thing that could go wrong. I didn't care what happened to me. I wanted to destroy them and everything they had. If I died, so be it. By the time I got there, it was well into the night. I shut off my headlights a few hundred yards from the outskirts of the town and pulled up slowly. There wasn't any noise or light. There wasn't any sign that there were people living there. It looked like what they wanted it to, an abandoned settlement that didn't deserve to be looked at twice. There was no sign of the lives they led below. I grabbed 2 of the gas cans from the trunk. I set one behind the building on the rear wall and walked behind around to the front. I pulled open to the door to the apothecary. A strange sense of disillusionment came over me. I had just been there earlier that day. I had peered through the window, not knowing what I know now, not seeing what I had seen. My brother was still alive the last time I had been in this building. I let the door close behind me. I checked to make sure no one was coming this way, but I hadn't been seen. Then I unscrewed the lid to the can. I dumped the contents out, drenching the cracked wooden slats that made up the floor of the store. I tossed them on the walls, the counters, and every surface until I bled the can dry. I tossed the can to the ground and it made a wet splash noise when it landed. Then I stepped back outside, checking again that the area was clear. I stood beyond the puddles of gas and then took the matches from my pocket. I shook one and held it up, staring briefly into the small flame, thinking about the repercussions I would be facing after I did this. I smiled, and then I dropped the match. Fire blazed alive, the flames licking their way through the apothecary, dancing across the floor and bounding up the walls. The wood was so dry that it didn't take long for the entire building to go up. After a moment, the window shattered, and I covered my eyes with my arm. I watched for several moments, mesmerized by the beauty of this destruction. And then someone screamed, "The well! Go get water!" I ducked behind the burning building, the heat kissing my skin as I raced around to the other side. People were running with small pails of water, trying in vain to save it. I watched with relish as I dashed back and forth. They lugged the water from the well, not accepting the fact that the structure was done for. Some of them stood in groups and hugged one another, their sobs filling the air over the sound of the roof caving and crashing to the foundation. "Who did this?" a woman screamed. "Who did it?" No one said anything. They just continued to hold each other. Tears ran down their faces. The yelling woman let out a frustrated cry and stumped her way back to the church. The rest stayed and watched as the fire continued to taste the night. I picked up the gas can I had sat behind the store earlier and then dove around the conjoining building beside it. It was out of the cultist's eye line when I got to the other side, so I ran from building to building until I hit the stretch of dirt path that led up to the church. A fierce satisfaction shocked my nerves. Righteous anger coursed throughout my body, lightening my cells so that I felt like I could tear the whole world down with only my fingers. I had caused them pain. I had caused them suffering. I wanted to cause more. They didn't notice me as I made my way to the church. To this day, I'm still unsure how. Surely someone was watching the blaze through the windows, but no one stopped me. If I was noticed, I was allowed to pass. Maybe they wanted me to. I opened the door of the church, slowly peering inside of the crack to determine it was empty. The door made a soft whoosh noise as it closed behind me, sucking the air in of the room with it. I prowled down the aisle, my step determined and sure. I uncapped the gas can as I walked up to the steps of the Diaz. I poured a puddle in front of the door, leading down to the lower levels, cutting off their exit, condemning them to death. I hadn't seen another way out when I was down there, and Tracy hadn't said one existed. I hope it didn't. After I drenched the carpet, I poured the rest of the gas on the tree. I made sure to douse the face of the thing in the tree, as if it were alive, as if I could drown it in penance for what it had done, for the pain it caused, for the pain it caused me. I stepped back to admire what I'd done. The wood was soaked, ready to combust under the ignition from my match. I pulled the pack out from my pocket and flicked one across the strike pad. It didn't take. I tried again. I wouldn't do that if I were you. I flinched and spun around. The priestess stood before me, her posture placid, her fingers laced together, and as she looked up at me with soft amusement. This was a woman who led the ritual, the woman who killed my brother, the woman who licked his blood off of her fingers as if he'd been a tasty midday snack. And why is that? I said, my voice steady, even as my hand shook. My anger flared, boiling beneath my skin until I could feel the heat of it lighting my brain on fire. I wanted to rip her eyes from her head and force them down her throat. I could see on her face that she knew what I was thinking. She took a step closer, daring me to. To put it simply, you'll die. She quirked her head to the side, staring at me carelessly the way a bird stares at a worm before it plucks it into its mouth to taste it. It was the same gesture the little boy had done earlier. I wondered if she was his mother, the soothing voice in the hallway that tempered the child's anger. What makes you care if I die? I said. I don't believe you do. She was at the top of the Diaz now, but it serves our purposes better if you don't. And what the freak did that mean? Let me guess, she said, a playful tone edging her voice now. The boy I killed, he was family? I didn't say anything. I just continued to stare at her as she further closed the space that separated us. My brother, perhaps. Her hands were clasped behind her back now. That same sardonic tilt of her lips plastered on her face. I narrowed my eyes at her, felt like she was a lion, prowling forward to test the waters before she pounced and drowned beneath the surface. You know, he fulfilled his purpose, his destiny. He was fated to be brought here, to provide succor to those who have perished. To be brought here, I said, my mind snagging on the phrasing. Who brought him here? Why, the glory of the Lord, of course, she said, and gestured to the tree I had soaked moments before. We serve him, and he protects us. He picks us up when we fall. He brings us back from the edge over and over again. Lord knows what we don't deserve it. But the Lord is a forgiving Lord. I rolled my eyes and scoffed. Rage crossed her face, a sharp and rapid reaction to my dismissal of the thing she had dictated her life to. Her shoulders tightened and her mouth stiffened. You dare disrespect the Lord? She said, her voice low and quaking. I could hear the anger simmering low in her throat. Our granddaughter, lady, freak your God. She screamed then, an unnaturally high, piercing shriek that splintered the air and brought me to my knees. I covered my ears with my hands as she brought a blade out from behind her back and raised it above her head. She ran at me, still emitting that shrill wail. The cultists who were outside ran in, the rest of them coming up from under the church as the sound of their leader calling them forth. They stood at attention, waiting for the priestess to lead them. She stabbed me with the knife. I let go of my ears to grab her hand. She pointed the tip over my chest where my heart was, pushing into the butt with her hand. She was strong, much stronger than I would have ever thought. She stood in a deadlock for a moment. I stared into her face. From further away, she looked normal like a regular person, but up close, her skin was thin and translucent, her sharp teeth and pointed. From further away, she looked normal like a regular person, but up close, her skin was thin and translucent, her teeth sharp and pointed. Her eyes were almost fully black. There was only a thin red line at the edge of the large pupil. My arms trembled from the effort of pushing her back. She started to gain traction, the tip of the blade edging closer and closer. The members had joined hands and they were swaying, their eyes closed as their voices joined together to sing out that same haunting melody I just heard earlier that day. I had to do something. I had to do it now. I smashed my forehead against her nose. She stumbled back, and blood flowing down her face like the current that carries a river. She wiped at her face with her sleeve, the blood barely visible on the red of her shirt. She spat on the floor. "You regret that." My shirt was soaked in a matter of moments. The priestess crackled, and then she charged at me. I held out an arm to stop her, but it was useless. She knocked me aside and grabbed the hilt of the knife. She twisted it. The pain seared deep beneath my skin, the tissue grinding and grating against the serrated metal. I was blinded for a moment, everything white and hazy as I dropped to my knees. She pulled the knife the rest of the way and then yanked it out. I braced myself against the door and gasped. I had never felt such intense pain before. My shoulder throbbed and I could hear my heart beat in my ears. I looked up at the priestess. She dragged the knife across her tongue, a red streak of my blood left behind. She took her tongue back into her mouth and swallowed. "Your brother tasted better." I wrapped my arms around her knees and shoved her to the ground. We crashed to the floor, our limbs tingling and our heads battling. She elbowed me in the face. My nose cracked under the impact and I tasted copper on my teeth. I punched at her measly, my fist landing lightly on her ribs and chest. She grabbed my hair and pulled my head back to stare into my eyes. "I'm going to enjoy eating you." She opened her mouth and positioned it over my neck. Time seemed to slow down and I felt every second as she clammed her jaws into my flesh. The cultists had grown louder, their song booming around us to the erratic pace of my heart. Her teeth grazed my skin, and then she bit down. She tore at the skin of my throat, and I screamed as she ripped it out. A burning heat spread along my neck. I put my hand over the wound and looked at the priestess. She chewed me deeply, savoring the taste. She pulled my hand away and went for another bite. I punched her in her face. 1 time, 2, 3, stunning her enough for me to shove her into her back. She tried to hit me, but I pushed her arms back and held them down. Then I saw the knife. It was laying about a foot away and on the carpet of the dais. I knocked her head into the floor and grabbed the knife. I stared into her creepy, black eyes as I shoved it into her sternum. She screamed, but I only pushed it further in, twisting it the way she had done to me. I yanked it out and did it again, and then I noticed the gatherers had stopped singing. One of them were crying, and the others looked at me with intense hatred. I could tell they wanted to kill me. One of the men took a step forward. Before he could take another, I grabbed the matches from my pocket and struck one. The flame danced gently in the stuffy air of the church. I took a few steps back, out of the area that was soaked in gasoline. The man stopped. He looked down at where he was standing. Then, he looked back up at me, and widened his eyes, his arms held aloft, as if to pacify me. The cultists who were at the door of the church had rushed up to the dais. They began to climb it, heading for me, trying to get me before I could set this place on fire. I looked back at the man. I bared my teeth at him. I dropped the match. It only took a few seconds for the tree to go up in flames. The fire blazed towards the ceiling, the searing heat singeing my eyes so that I had to take a step back. The fire formed a half circle on the dais, blocking it and all the parishioners on the other side, trapping them. They couldn't go back down into the church, and they couldn't step off the dais. They screamed and congregated in the middle, the part that was untouched by the fire. The area was too small for all of them, so they pushed the outliers into the blaze. They shrieked and flailed for several moments, their flesh blistering and tearing, their hair lighting up like hay. I gagged at the pungent smell. They fell to the floor, their bodies landing with heavy thuds. By By the time they died, the fire made its way over to the carpet to the rest of the cultists. I turned away as they did, too. They were consumed by the flames. The priestess laughed madly, her hysterical mirth feeling out of place in context of this moment. She wiped tears from her eyes. "You have no idea what you've just done." A deafening crack split through the room. I turned towards the tree, which was splintering and breaking apart like an animal breaks out of its shell at birth. I watched, horrified, as something tore its way out. Claws came out first, long and sharp, as black as charcoal. Then its arms, which looked almost human, but the skin was scabbed and oozing pus. And then its head, topped with large, stretching antlers that bowed to the sky. The thing broke out, shattering the tree so that it fell apart, pieces of it tearing through the room like shrapnel. It let out a thunderous roar and spread its arms wide. A long, scaled tail whipped around behind it. I stumbled, but my feet lost contact with the ground and I fell back. I plunged through the air for several moments, until I made contact with something. It was members that gathered at the base of the dais. They broke my fall, but they didn't stop me as I crashed to the ground. Chaos. Chaos, chaos. Everything was chaos. Deafening screams and cries of fright filled the room as people rushed away from the creature. They stampeded to the doors of the church, trampling me where I lay. I gasped for breath, but the way of them crushing me. And then the thing advanced. It stepped on the priestess, the long claws of its foot spearing her body, impaling her. The grin was still on her face, blood bubbling out of her mouth and staining her cheeks in a mock Glasgow smile. The thing leaped off the dais into the crowd of people. It stood about 9 feet tall, towering over them, who looked like ants beneath it. It moved to the blocked doors of the church. They stood huddled together, trembling as they stared up at the god. One man stepped forward. "My lord," he said, his voice wavering as he clasped his hands together. He dropped to his knees. "I have served you my entire life. I have done everything you required of me. I've done everything in service of you. Please let me go. Please, let me leave." The thing quirked its head at the man, and I couldn't tell if it understood him or not. Then it grabbed the man's head and crushed it between its palms. The others tried to run away, but the thing tore through them like they were ribbon. It slashed and hacked, tearing their bodies apart as easily as scissors tear through paper. It tossed people into the walls like they were rag dolls, their skulls cracking against the concrete before they fell into the floor in bloody heaps. I got to my feet, but I had nowhere to go. The fire was licking its way up the aisle of the church, and soon there would be nothing between me and this thing. I had only time to briefly wonder if it was really their god when it punched a hole through the last cultist's stomach. Then it turned to me. I had never been a religious person. I grew up atheist in a family of atheists. Church had never been a part of my life, and every time someone tried to convert me, I just nodded in humor and moved on with my life. So in that moment, after all the crap I had seen that day, staring into the face of this unnatural creature that shouldn't exist, it didn't occur to me to pray, to reach out to some god I had never known, to save my life. Instead, my mind turned to Cody, and I had only one thought. "I'll see you soon, buddy." The creature lumbered towards me, crawling on all fours with its swaying tail through the air. Its face was horrifying. It had the smooth skin of a human, but there was no nostrils where its nose should be. Its eyes were bright and blue, and they had an innocent expression in them, as if it just hadn't annihilated dozens of people minutes before. It stopped in front of me, sitting on its hind legs like a dog would when it begs for a treat. My brow frowned. Why hadn't it killed me yet? Why was it just sitting there watching me, observing me? It reached a cloud then, and dragged a talon along my throat. The sharp tip of it nicked my neck. I trembled where I stood, barely maintaining the strength to hold myself up. I closed my eyes. This was it. This was where it ended. Gunshots rang throughout the church. The creature reared back and swung around with a ferocious bellow. There were police standing in the doorway, 6 of them, their guns drawn and pointed at the creature. I could see their cruisers parked outside, the red and blue lights melding together to create a purple haze. The cops didn't say anything. What was there to say? They just pulled their triggers on their weapons and unloaded their clips at the creature. It howled with every piercing bullet and flinched from the impact. But it didn't seem to do anything other than piss the creature off. There was a small window in which all the cops reloaded their guns, pulling their mags out from their belts and shoving them into the butts of the guns. This is when the creature pounced. It bent down on all fours and sprang at the men, the muscles in all of its haunches loading like a spring to launch it forward. It landed on one of the officers, smashing his head into the floor as it faced another cop. The man looked horrified, terror etched into every one of his features before the creature ripped his throat out like it was tissue paper. Another one of the officers pressed the barrel of a shotgun to the creature's head and wasted no time in pulling the trigger. It did nothing. The creature's skin was singed, the flesh blackened and bruised, but there was no wound. I didn't wait around to see what it did next. I looked around, searching for an exit, and then I noticed one I hadn't earlier. Where there had once been a stained glass window, there was now only a gap in the wall of the church. I clambered through it, not looking back as I did. I ran across the dirt ground and towards the apothecary that I had burned down. The flames had long since died, and now it was just a smoldering pile of rubble set against the dark of the night. I stumbled past it in the direction of where I parked my car. I held my hand against my neck. It wasn't bleeding as much now. It felt pretty shallow. I was losing the energy to keep going, to keep fighting. I felt that if there were a bed in front of me at this moment, I could fall asleep into it, and sleep for a very long time. I hoped that wasn't the blood loss talking. I finally made it to my car and unlocked it. I heard another raging roar in the distance and I hastened into the car. I started it and pulled out into the road, hoping the thing would let me go. I drove along for a minute or so, and then the car lurched backward. I pushed the accelerator to the floor, but it still wouldn't move. The smell of burning rubber filled the interior, and I could see the smoke billowing around the front. And in the rearview mirror, there was a creature, holding the car and staring at the back of my head. The momentum slammed me forward, and it was all I could do to bring my hands up to keep my face from smashing into the steering wheel. The creature climbed off and turned around, staring at me through the shattered windshield. It stayed like that for a good minute, and then it lumbered around to the driver's side window. It pointed at me and gestured at the pavement. The heck? I pushed down on the window switch, and as it rolled down, the creature and I stared at each other. I placed my hands on the steering wheel as if the creature was a cop and I had just been pulled over. I wish I was somewhere so mundane right now. The creature reached out at me, again, taking a tall one of its claws along my neck. I turned my head away and sniffed, fear taking hold of all the energy I had left. My muscles were taut and my breath trembled. I almost wished this thing would kill me if it meant the end of this misery. And then the creature pulled its claw away and turned around. It walked into the desert, its steps slow and pace measured. I watched it go until I no longer could see it, and then I tried to start my car. It was a long shot, of course, given how horribly the creature had destroyed it. The metal was crumbled and the windshield shattered. The hood was flattened like a pancake, and when I turned the key in the ignition, my hand shaking so horribly I had to hold it with my other hand to keep it still. Nothing happened. The engine didn't even make a noise. I had to go back and get one of the police cruisers. It took a while, the adrenaline wearing off, so that everything felt twice as slow and my body moved sluggishly. When I got back to the church, I didn't go inside. I could see piles of bodies through the door, parts of people spilling out into the steps. I fell into one of the cop cars, the keys dangling from the ignition, the headlights still on. I put the vehicle in reverse. I turned it around and sped off in the opposite direction. When I got back to the grocery store where I'd left Tracy, she was nowhere to be found. The store was closed. I think it was sometime after midnight, so I drove around until I found the police station. There were 2 cars in the lot, the cruiser and one civilian. I limped inside and walked up to the receptionist's counter. She took one look at me, stood quickly and backed away. "Hi," I said, my eyes drooping shut. I tried to ask her where Tracy was, but I couldn't even get the words out of my mouth. The only sound that came out was slurred incoherence. I collapsed to the floor, my body refusing to fight as it forced my eyes closed. When I woke up, I was in a hospital room. I groaned and moved to cover my eyes to block out the bright ceiling lights. And that's when I noticed I was handcuffed to the bed. "What the heck?" I said, pulling on the metal, chaining me to the railing. "Hey, you okay? You okay, Ethan?" I looked to my right, where Tracy was sitting in the chair next to the bed. "Tracy, why the heck am I handcuffed?" "They said it was for your protection. That was obviously bullcrap. They're the police, so I can't do much." She stood up and walked to the door, poking her head out to someone in the hallway. "He's awake," she said, loud enough that I could hear it from where I lay. She came back inside the room, a cop following behind her. He was tall, with a classic look, a neat haircut held in place by gel, a stubble growing along his jaw. He looked exactly like the kind of person who would become a cop. "Ethan, I'm Officer Matthews." He held his hand out for me to shake it. "Aye, Officer Matthews," I said. "Care to enlighten me as to why I'm in freaking handcuffs?" His expression soured. He turned all business then. "We're holding you until we can figure out what happened at the church. So far, you're the only witness we have." "So far?" I said. Officer Matthews put his hands in his pockets. "We have an officer in crucial care." I bit back my shock. How did anyone survive that? I looked back at Officer Matthews and I couldn't tell for sure, but it seemed like he could read what I was thinking, as if it was written plainly on my face. "So," said Officer Matthews, "want to tell me what happened out there?" "Not really." But I did. I took him through everything that happened, from the voicemails, to the first time I went to Site 49, to the second. I detailed the entire day. The more I explained, the more I could see him doubting what I was saying. Even with part of Tracy's statement corroborating mine, he still didn't believe me. Not that I could blame him. A cannibalistic cult is one thing, but a godlike creature bursting from a tree and killing dozens of people is a little more difficult to swallow. Matthews finished writing my statement on his pad and tucked it into the breast pocket of his jacket. He then crossed his arms and stared at me. "You know, lying to a police officer is a crime, right?" I leveled my gaze and stared into his eyes. "I guess it's a good thing I'm not lying, then." Matthews bit back a smirk and left the room. I turned back to Tracy. Did all of that really happen?" she asked. I scoffed. Are you serious? You don't believe me either?" She grabbed my uncuffed hand. "I know you've been through a lot. We both have." She paused. I could see her working up the courage for what she was going to say next. But sometimes when we go through something really traumatic," I yanked my hand from hers. "I know what happened. I didn't just imagine it." She didn't say anything else when we fell into silence. I laid with my head against the pillow and faced away from Tracy. Images from that night played through my mind as clearly as they were in a movie. All that blood, all that carnage. I'd seen enough of it to last 30 lifetimes. After 20 or so minutes, Officer Matthews came back into the room. He was grinning. "Good news. The officer in the ICU woke up, and his stories matched yours. Now, you either have an incredibly detailed shared delusion that coincidentally matches up with real-life events, or you're telling the truth. I'm thinking it's the latter. You're free to go, Ethan." Tracy and I looked at each other. She looked shocked, like her entire universe had just been shattered. I resisted the smug smile that was trying to make its way out to my face. "Just like that?" I said. Matthews nodded, sticking his key into the hole of the cuffs and unlocking them. "To be honest, I believed your story from the start. This place is..." He paused, looking for the right word. "Different, to say the least. There's nothing out of the realm of possibility here." And then he left the room, tucking the cuffs into a pouch in his belt. Tracy hugged me tightly. It took a couple of days to sort things out, but eventually Tracy and I arranged a flight to get back home. We sat together on an airplane, barely speaking, unable to pull ourselves from our disenchanted stupors. Our flight touched down, and together we walked through the airport and stepped past the automatic doors and outside. "Well, I'll be seeing you," Tracy said, and then she hugged me. We held each other tightly, knowing that what she said was wrong. We were never going to see each other again. Maybe it would be for the better that way. "See you later," I said, as she got into a cab. I waved at her as she pulled away, and waited until she was out of sight before I got in my own. The cab dropped me off in the front of my apartment. I handed him 220 to the open passenger window and turned around to face my building. I walked inside and up the 2 flights of stairs to my door, feeling the exhaustion pull at my shoulders tight. I took my keys out of my pocket and slid them into the deadbolt. I unlocked the door and kicked it open, welcoming the side of my apartment. It felt different now, hollow. The light shining through my windows felt false, too bright and too warm. All of my things were right where I left them, but it didn't feel like my things anymore. This life felt like it belonged to someone else, someone from a long time ago, someone far removed from who I was now. It's funny how it only took one day to change that. I sat down at my desk and stared through the blinds into the street below. My mother walked along with her child, his small hand interlocked with her larger one. On the other side of the street, a man and a woman sat and talked, laughing at each other's jokes and leaning into each other. They had no idea what was really out there, what the world was really capable of throwing at them. I pushed up the screen of my laptop and typed in the URL for the society. I had to tell them what happened. I had to warn them about Site 49, about what would happen if they went there. They had to know that some things weren't a joke, that they should tread with caution in the future. But when I hit the enter key to go to the site, this is what popped up. Error 404, page not found. What? An alert popped up on my screen, telling me that I had just received an email. I moved my cursor over to it and clicked on it. Dear beloved reader, unfortunately, due to unforeseen complications, we had to shut down the site. We do not have a plan to start a new website at this time. Perhaps we will in the future, but for now, we urge you to find other sources for all things supernatural. The internet is a vast place. We're sure you can find something that will sedate your need to know. We thank you for your support over the years, and we hope to see you again should we ever choose to bring the site back to life. I was about to click off the email, baffled at the timing of this with everything that had happened, and them shutting down the site, when I noticed the scroll bar had room to go down farther than the end of the email. I pushed the cursor down to the end, and at the bottom was one last paragraph. And to Ethan, who didn't realize just how far the little flap of his wings would go, we only have one thing to say. We'll see you again. I hope you guys enjoyed this story. Thank you guys for listening. Now, special thanks to the Redditor /Maryland Spirit for granting me permission to narrate his series. Now, I enjoyed narrating this series a lot, and as always, please make more. Now, once more, thank you guys for listening, and I'll see you guys in the next story. So, don't forget to sit back, relax, and indulge in fear.